tent at the Royal Agricultural Show in Wales. We're delighted to be here for the next few days with a big Wildlife Trust presence here, mingling with delegates at the Royal Welsh Show. And delighted for this next session, we're going to be looking at soil. I'm Craig Bennett, I'm Chief Exec of the Wildlife Trusts across the UK, and we're joined by a brilliant panel here to discuss soil and ask, is it a dirty word? Moving from the left to the right, we have Niels Corfield, who's a consultant on soil. We have Sam Kenyon from Nature Friendly Farming Network Wales. We have Dr. Non Williams from Farming Connect. We have Andrew Tuddenham from the Soil Association, and we have Professor Bridget Emmett from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. I'm going to come to each of the panellists now and ask them just to say a few words about soil and its importance and what they think are the key issues of the debate around soil at the moment. And then we're going to sort of open it up into broader questions. I've got a few questions to put to the panel, have a bit of a conversation, and then out to the audience for questions as well. So hope you enjoy the session. So Niels, I'm going to come to you first if I can, please. Tell us a little bit about your work as a consultant, what you do, and what do you think are some of the kind of really critical issues around soil at the moment, particularly in Wales?
Thanks, Craig. So my name is Niels Corfield. I work as an independent farming advisor and trainer. And part of that work is to go out and to support farmers to adopt soil health practices in whatever their context is, whether that be grazing or arable, upland or lowland. And that work has taken me out to monitor over 200 farms now right across the UK. And I can now say, based on that sort of direct observation, through doing spade tests and infiltration rate tests in the field, I can now say that I'm firmly convinced that soil health is probably, or poor soil health is probably one of the key weaknesses or key threats to UK production, whether that be upland, lowland, beef and sheep and dairy, across the board.
And what do you see as some of the really burning issues around soil at the moment? You say it's a key issue, but what are some of the problems you're seeing?
Well, essentially, the lack of soil structure, lack of soil health, is meaning that the interaction with water, particularly, is very poor, and that means that water stands on the surface of the soil for extended periods. So that's meaning we've got much longer housing periods, for example, and equally then when these dry periods do roll around, because the water hasn't been able to penetrate into the soil, the sponge, essentially, because it's essentially just run off, it means we've got very little soil moisture available to then drive production in a forage-based system as we go into the season, and that's really what's driving drought. So both flood and drought essentially are two sides of the same coin of that poor soil health issue.
And what are the main reasons why that's happening?
Well, effectively, once soil health is lost, compaction is the end result. So essentially, what we find is a very blocky soil, really across the board in all different soil types.
But what's causing that? What's causing the blocky soil in the first place? What's causing what's causing degradation in soil health, would you say, primarily?
In general, we would normally sort of reduce that to management practices, historical management practices. That might be set stocking, for example, nutrient management practices. But essentially, all of it sort of translates in a forage-based system to very shallow rooting or sparse rooting, and without that deep turf, soil structure is lost, essentially.
Okay. Thanks very much, Niels. Well, we'll be hearing more from you as this session goes on. So next up is Sam Kenyon. Sam, welcome. You're from the Nature Friendly Farming Network in Wales. You are a farmer yourself. Tell us a little bit about your farm, what you farm and where is it?
So hi, I'm Sam. I farm on the River Elwy in North Wales near St Asaph. Just got a small flock of sheep. We were 160 acres, but 60 acres of that is woodland. So with the Elwy running through the place, it's actually only about 70 acres of fields. So small flock of sheep, and we've rent a small parcel out for vegetable growing as well, just to give someone else a chance of access to land.
Great, thank you, Sam. So tell us, what's at the Nature Friendly Farming Network for Wales? Tell us a little bit, first of all, about that organisation, that grouping?
Yeah, so Nature Friendly Farming Network is an organisation made up of farmers across the whole UK. So we've got 10 farmers on each steering group for each country, so Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales and England. And while some of the staff are then lobbying government, they're actually steered by what us on the farms and on the land want to see or need to see happen on our farms and across the landscape. So, you know, we need our farms to be profitable and to be secure businesses, but we don't want to be the reason why biodiversity is disappearing. We want to be the solution, and we want to help deliver nature-based solutions for the wider society, as well as to secure our food as well.
And what do you see in particular, the Nature Friendly Farming Network across the UK, but in Wales in particular, what do you see as key issues around soils at the moment?
For me personally, I'm seeing, I think what Niels has touched on is the compaction, and then the issues that we're seeing with that, with the weather. We're going sort of boom and bust, so we're going between flood and drought, and I think perhaps I'm guilty of it as well, carrying a lot of livestock that don't move around the farm enough, so I'm not resting enough pastures. I don't want to say that that's a problem all across everyone's farms. That's not down to me to say, but I can say that that's definitely happening on my farm. And by joining the NFFN, it's really helped me to find other farmers who are in the same boat, and then for us to sort of swap ideas and do that whole knowledge exchange thing. And it's just made me a bit more confident about realising where I make some mistakes, that there are staff in the background who are lobbying government for better knowledge exchange. But it's just made me feel more confident about trying new things, and finding what works and what doesn't, rather than staying with this is how it's always been done, so maybe I'll just stick with that because I feel more confident.
Great, thanks so much, Sam. Well, we'll be hearing more from you as this session goes on. Next up to my immediate right is Dr. Non Williams from Farming Connect. Non is a carbon specialist officer. Non, first of all, tell us a little bit about Farming Connect for those that don't know.
Yes, bore da. Good morning. Good to be here this morning. So Farming Connect is a knowledge transfer and advisory service for agricultural businesses in Wales, funded by the Welsh Government. So it's eligible for all farmers that register with us, and we have lots of different sub-teams within Farming Connect. So I sit within Farming Connect's technical team, and we work directly at the moment within our network with about 220 farms, running over 90 projects, of which quite a few of them is relating back to soil health, either directly or indirectly.
Great. And what are the issues you're seeing around soils in Wales through that work?
Yeah, so I think we have just under 20 projects which are directly looking at soil health. So one important point to make is all of these projects are farmer-led. So we work with the farmer to try and tackle any challenges or issues they feel they have on their farms. Niels and Sam have touched upon some of the issues that we see that relate to factors deriving from management practices, but also, as Sam relayed there, obviously changes in climate that we've had in recent years has really impacted how our farmers are managing their soils and their land. So we're trying to put a positive spin on it, that we are seeing farmers coming to us wanting to do projects and wanting to tackle the issues they see on their farm. One point to make with soil, of course, is that seeing changes and positive changes is a slow process. So we're working with those farmers to try and improve the knowledge and the management of the land, and also to transfer that information to the industry wider across Wales.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Non. So moving on now to Andrew Tuddenham, who's with Soil Association Cymru. Andrew, people will be, I'm sure, very familiar with the Soil Association, but maybe just give a bit of an introduction if they're not.
Thanks, Craig. Well, actually, not many people are. And so Soil Association, it's at its heart is a charity. We were set up by Lady Eve Balfour, who was one of the earliest organic pioneers in the 20th century. And she actually cut her teeth with farming near Newport, in Monmouthshire, as it was at the time. and then developed the charity, the Soil Association, which was really the answer, the counter to what was becoming an increasingly chemical approach to farming, so farming with more inputs. What she was doing was pioneering the way of using soil health to provide all the nutrition that the farm needs, and to focus the farming system entirely on soils, hence Soil Association. We might be more well known for our trading arm, Soil Association Certification, which is one of the organic control bodies, which certifies in Wales about a third of the organic farms in Wales. And more recently, we've set up Soil Association Exchange, which is a platform that allows farmers to measure and demonstrate their impact across a whole range of metrics. Plus, there's a load of schools work as well, because we're looking at the food system in the round and seeing that it needs to be seen as in the round. It's all linked. The quality of our food is dependent on the quality of our soils, and the quality of our nutrition is dependent on our food.
Right, okay. And what do you see as, again, I'm going to ask you the same question I've asked the others. What do you see as some of the sort of burning issues around soils at the moment?
Well, I think we've got to recognise how much intensification is taking us in the wrong direction with soils, and particularly with the inputs that go with intensification. Basically, the need, because food isn't provided a fair reward in the marketplace, and so the pressure on farming has been to scale up, to intensify. With that, with a finite amount of land, comes the need, as it was in the 20th century, to use inputs to provide the nutrition or to counteract any adverse nutritional impact. That's taking us in the wrong direction. We're seeing that with some soils which are now at a saturation point for some of the nutrition, for some of the nutrients like phosphates, and that is now appearing in waterways. The Wye is one of the best examples, the worst examples, I should say, in the UK, if not, wider than that. And bagged nitrogen, artificial nitrogen, really, I think the sector does recognise that it has a problem with this, and it is trying to find ways to reduce its reliance on nitrogen. But maybe Niels could speak a bit more about the exact impact and interaction with soil health, because it's very important.
Yeah, this issue about high inputs and actually the impact that has on soil, but also how it leaves farmers vulnerable to the hikes in prices of inputs, is something I think will be important for us to explore over the next little while, for sure. Andrew, thank you very much. And then we have Professor Bridget Emmett, who's with the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. Bridget, again, tell us a little bit about your centre, first of all.
So we used to be public sector. We're now a not-for-profit charity. We have 4 stations across the UK, Scotland, 2 in England, and I'm in the Welsh one. And we've got about 700 researchers. And our job is really to deliver long-term monitoring and modelling and review and experimentation across the land, freshwater and air interfaces. So our job is that system. You've probably heard about some of our sister organisations like the British Geological Society that does the deep earth, and then the National Oceanographic Centre that does the marine. So if you like, there's these research institutes that have carved up the natural environment into these discipline sectors, and we're the one for land, water and air. So that's who we are.
Great, thank you. And you've also been leading a Welsh Government programme, haven't you, around this? You want to say a little bit more about that?
Yes, so the ARAMP programme, which does actually stand for something, it's the Environment Rural Affairs Monitoring and Modelling platform. We're responsible for monitoring the change in quite a large number of the resources across Wales. So let me go through them. Vegetation, plant diversity, pollinators, birds, soil health, which we'll come back to, headwaters, ponds, what's the impact on what's changing in our historic environment features, and even our public footpaths. So we run a national monitoring programme for Welsh Government. The reports on the national trends of all those different resources, and also what has been the effect of Glass-Tier, which is the current agri-environment scheme, as you know. So we've just delivered the report into Welsh Government for our findings since we last reported in 2016. So watch this space. I can't tell you what the results are teaser right there. But anyway, our job is to try and provide the evidence of how what all the farmers do stack up at a national scale.
But can you tell us at least what the headlines as to what it tells us, particularly in relation to soils?
Yeah, so it's not a great story, as Niels said. In a way, it's amazing that we're managing to hold the line as much as we can. So at the moment, there's no evidence that our soils are increasing, say, their carbon stores. But then again, we're not particularly losing them, except in our peatlands, which are losing their carbon. Okay, we have started again acidification of our soils, probably because we're not using enough lime with our fertilizer that Andrew was talking about. And compaction. I think every member of the panel has talked about the structure of our soil and how that influences the rate that water flows off our soils. And we just have to recognize that we've increased the number of livestock on our soils by about 5-fold since the 1850s. And those animals are heavier. And our grassland systems tend to be monoculture. So we've got to find new ways of trying to help our systems break up the soil, get more air, get more structure, and allow water to flow through. That will also help to build up carbon, and it will also help soil health in the round. Because remember, 25% of all biodiversity globally calls soil its home. So it's not very sexy, but soil biodiversity is 25% of all biodiversity. And they do not like being squished into a little compact bit of soil. They need air, they need space, they need to be able to live. So I'm with Andrew. Nutrients, compaction, and something that seems like it's old school, but actually is quite important, is acidification. And it's starting again. Probably a bit of a climate signal, and probably just because if you put on fertilizer and don't do lime at the same time, you will acidify your soils.
Okay, so it's not just coral reefs that are facing that, it's also soils, acidification.
Absolutely, yeah. So we did this massive experiment called the Industrial Revolution that put sulfur and NOx into the atmosphere. We managed to kill our heavy industry off, which sorted the sulfur problem out. We've still got nitrogen, and I'm afraid agriculture is the biggest source of ammonia, which can contribute both nitrogen eutrophication and acidification. But then what we do to our soils when we artificially fertilize is acidify, I'm afraid. And a lot of our native plants and quite a lot of the biodiversity in the soil doesn't like getting lots of acidity. I mean, it's not surprising, is it?
And just explain for people that aren't familiar with this, why is it that too many nutrients actually results in a simpler grasses and so on, and less plant diversity? Because that's quite hard to a lot of people. That's counterintuitive.
It is. Well, our native vegetation, most of our soils in Wales are actually nutrient deficient. That's why farmers add fertilizer, because they want to grow grasses very often to compensate for the fact that our soils are nutrient poor. But that means in our nature reserves and everywhere else, our native vegetation can't compete with these aggressive grasses and things like bramble. So as soon as you've got more nitrogen and phosphorus, a few species go, great, fantastic, I'm off now. And they grow taller, they grow more competitive, and they outcompete our native flora. And as soon as that happens, you just get a far grassier vegetation, which might seem great for our livestock, but actually we should just put nitrogen on where we need it, and preferably use something like clover. But because a lot of the nitrogen comes out the back of cows and from near pastures, goes up in the air, goes on to our nature reserves. So we put a fence around our nature reserves. It doesn't stop the nitrogen coming in. It comes in 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, falls on top of all our nature reserves. And that's basically pushing a loss of biodiversity. And we've been seeing it for 30, 40 years now. Simplification of our vegetation as the grasses, the brambles, the taller vegetation take over at the expense of our little flowering plants. So that's what's happening.
So when you see very green hillsides that look really, really green, lots of people might think, oh, that's amazing, that looks brilliant. But actually, perhaps not so.
Well, it depends what you want that land for. If it's for conservation, that's probably not what you want. If it is an improved grassland and its purpose is to grow our food, then that could be okay. But I would still go in that bit of improved grassland Is there a mix of species? Are the roots going to depth? Is there a mix of clover? Is the soil structure good? So I'm not saying green is bad at all. All I'm saying is it's an oversimplification of green is good or bad. You can't say that.
Great, Bridget, thank you very much. So you've heard from the panel here, a whole range of issues is about some of the challenges faced with soils. We've heard about compaction. We've heard about the level of inputs going into our soils, artificial inputs. We've heard about losing soil carbon, acidification, and indeed all this leading to soil erosion as well, more broadly. But what's also very interesting is how these issues interact with each other, and so on. Let's just go a little bit more into the issue about compaction. You know, we've heard that a lot of that is caused because of, you just said, Bridget, there's 5 times more livestock on the hills now than there would have been in the 1850s, and a lot of those are heavier as well. Is it just livestock? Are there other reasons as well why we're seeing the compaction? Who wants to react? Go on, Bridget.
I think there's machinery as well we
Yeah.
need to think of, and climate change is now really not helping. So we have wetter soils in the winter and drier soils, and that is really, really challenging for our farmers. How do, Farming Connect is critical here.
You mean the variability between them?
The variability, well, if you've got wet soils, getting your animals and machinery out in wet soils is really going to increase compaction. But we need people to get out in the land. So we're going to need, different types of vehicles, different ways of managing our land. We're going to have to get the vegetation rooting structure to do some of the work for us. But I'll let others speak, but I think it's a combination. Go for it, Sam.
So our farm historically, so we came to it 7 years ago. For 20 years up to that point, it had predominantly been used for growing maize. So it had heavy machinery on it, often compared to what it is now, where because I've returned it back to pasture, I'm using the animals to farm the place. But we're also on a floodplain, so quite often this is where maize is grown, is on the fertile soils of the floodplains. So we've got historic compaction, but then we've also got erosion happening as well. And we've for us, and I think for quite a bit of land around us, perhaps, is the compaction issue is historic, and it is taking so much time to correct that. I think it's a lot of time, considering we're in a climate emergency. I've been doing herbal lays for 4 years. I now need to get machinery back onto the place to re-establish the herbs. I need to be fussier about what herbs I use, so I go for longevity in my plants, rather than these that just seem to fade out after 3 years. They have been amazing for the livestock health. There's no questioning that. Now that I've run out of herbs, I'm now back to dosing regularly on the animal welfare side, medication side. But I think what a lot of us don't realise is how long it takes to see the improvement in the function of the soil, seeing those pores appear and seeing that crumbly texture develop. I thought that, if we all turn to this within the lifespan of that seed, of that herbal lay, sort of 4 years, we could make a real impact. We could really turn things around. But it's not the case. It's going to take a long time, and I don't think that message gets across sometimes.
So there's a real legacy, like in your farm, from the compaction that came from vehicles, basically, machinery moving across it to grow maize before your time, essentially.
But also the amount of weight that comes with flood water during winter.
Okay, right.
Yeah, because if we... I probably didn't make that clear. It's got the weight of the water in a flood over winter, and then in spring it's got the weight of machinery, and in autumn it's got the weight of machinery. So there's only one season of the year where it hasn't had weight and roots have been able to get down, and that's been my soil's life story for 20 years of its life. And trying to turn that around is taking a long time.
And Sam, why would have your predecessors have been growing maize on that farm?
Because...
what would have incentivised them to do that?
They're a big dairy farm with an indoor herd.
Yeah.
And when I'm from a milking background, but in Sussex. I know I have a small farm, and so some people think I'm like the token farmer, but I'm from a 1,000-acre council farm down in Sussex that was arable and dairy and a suckler herd as well. And so I understand the pressure on the farming system to get those nutrients into the animals to produce that crop, the milk, whatever it is. cost effective as possible. So I understand why maize was grown, but it just doesn't suit everywhere.
Yeah, sure. Andrew, I could see you revving up with your microphone.
Yeah, it's worth just noting that about 40% of Welsh soils are vulnerable to compaction just because of their very nature. They're naturally clay-rich and prone to waterlogging. So there is that to consider. But I think the point about intensification of farming and what that brings is key to it. It's sort of a bit of an onslaught on soils. It's the inputs of artificial nitrogen which are effectively switching off quite a lot of the soil biology and making it more prone to this compaction. And then it's the other things that farmers are having to do to meet their nutritional needs of cattle, more cattle in particular, through growing maize. And maize is becoming more and more prevalent in Wales. It has to be seen. Again, this is not the best land for that sort of system. Slopes, high rainfall, maybe vulnerable soils. It's not a good look. And there are some interesting developments around undersowing so that the crop, when it comes off in the autumn, isn't left with bare soil underneath. So hopefully that can go some way, but it is a very high-risk practice.
Yeah. So, I mean, farmers will know that last thing they want is to lose productivity of their soils. Soils is fundamentally the most, hugely important asset for farmers. But for years, farming policy has sort of incentivised this focus on the short term and causing these kind of challenges. I mean, Norm, what's your sense about how this could be turned around, now that what needs to happen to turn around some of these declines in soil health over many years?
Yeah, I'd like to just pick up on some of the points made in the last few questions, just from a Farming Connect perspective. I've mentioned the projects that we're working with, but as I mentioned at the start, we're an advisory service for all eligible farming businesses in Wales. And through our advisory service, we offer nutrients management planning. And those plans, I would say, is probably our most popular service. So I think it's really important to note, and Sam's touched upon this, that farmers are aware of how important their soils are. And they do sort of go out wanting that service, wanting to actually get the data so that they are managing the land appropriately. Just over last autumn or winter, there was over 3,000 soil samples taken through our service. So obviously that data, is really useful for that farm going forward. But just going back to one of Sam's points about the land and the requirements during different seasons of the year, and I think that's something we're seeing with our projects is farmers are wanting, to look at deeper rooting structure so that they are able to tackle compaction along with some other issues, for example, droughts. We've seen, some drought summers, not necessarily this summer, but, we are seeing farmers wanting to tackle some of these issues in different ways. But what we've seen from our project work is that, as we all know, not one farm is the same as the farm next door. So what will work for one farm might be very different for another farm in Wales. And I think we need to be careful that we don't overgeneralise and that we look at each farm individually. And that is a challenge, I think. Sam made the point about the fact that change is gradual when it comes to soil. So we're seeing the farmers are eager, they want this data, but seeing the impact of it is a very slow process. And we've done quite a few projects ongoing at the moment, looking at things such as biodiversity below ground, earthworm counts, looking at the soil structure. And you have very different situations in the same area of land, different times of the year. So there's a lot of things, a lot of factors contributing here. And it's how we manage that on an individual farm basis to get to where we want to be.
Great. Niels, we've been talking here a lot about this problem of compaction in particular. What's the sort of advice you give farmers when they're faced with soil compaction? How do you kind of try and reverse that? What are the best processes to do that?
Yeah, okay. So I think probably one of the sort of key aspects to the approach is trying to offer farmers an empirical approach to any new practice. I mean, essentially, we're sort of offering a selection of novel practices which will have varying appropriateness to different soil types, as well as different times of the year, for example. So the thinking is really to try and offer them some tools that they can use to be able to evidence success of any particular intervention. And they can use those same tools to baseline as well, so to essentially identify where they're at already. And normally we use an infiltration rate test to do that, so they can do some infiltration rate tests in the field and compare that against an area that's out of management, for example. And that helps to put aside some of those questions around soil type, for example. And then essentially we're into that sort of solutions kind of matrix kind of process, so mechanical, mineral, biological management interventions essentially. And mechanical interventions can be things like subsoiling, roller slitting, the use of gypsum, for example. There's all good efficacy in the literature for those types of interventions. Very little of it is from the UK, so we have to sort of borrow and glean what we can, basically. And again, this is the other point about moving to this empirical approach. So, do a test strip, for example, and leave an untreated area after doing your due diligence with spade, for example, to identify that you're in the weather window that you think that's appropriate for this particular intervention, then intervene on a small area, and then come back again immediately with the spade and look for positive or negative indicators below ground. And whenever we're seeing negative indicators, essentially come back another day or change the kit, essentially. And I think through that sort of iterative process where they can evidence success, again, using the spade and the infiltration ring, for example, they can then gradually sort of roll out those successful practices to wider acres, and also then cost out or model some of those sort of gross margin factors based on larger areas from those small test strips, essentially.
Thanks, Niels. Bridget?
Yeah, just to completely support what the last two speakers have said, the range, we get very, very nervous about what you can read on social media, about people going, you can get X more tons of carbon in your soil in 2 years. And I don't blame people for reading that, but this empirical and evidence approach, and also recognizing the range of outcomes that people get, depending what their starting point was, how degraded they were, what their soil type was, what their vegetation. And we've done, for Welsh Government, we recently, in sheer desperation, got together 5 soils specialists and who really, do work for the internationally and the greenhouse gas inventory, and just asked them to actually report on the range that you get for all these different regen ags. And there's some leaflets down here, English and Welsh, that summarize that basically just try to help moderate. So you can't just go and pick your best ever study or farm that someone's done and go, oh, I'm going to get that. You need to know that there's other people that have got 100th less than those people were saying. So I strongly advise, it's available on our website, to come and look at this, because this is, as environmental scientists, we're exactly, like with Niels, trying to help people really try and get proper evidence and not send, it's the kind of wild west out there, particularly with respect to carbon, frankly, and we need to manage expectations, because it's just going to really annoy people if they go, well, I was told I would get this and I'm not getting it now. So please do pick up a leaflet and just see the sheer range in values you'll get from herbal lays or fertilizer management or biochar or all these things that people keep selling to you. Please come and just find out what the current evidence and range in evidence is at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. But while we're at it, Bridget, it might be good just to explain a little bit about the importance of carbon in soils, because a lot of the discussion at the moment, a lot of the excitement about getting carbon back into soils is about, obviously the role that can play in taking carbon out of the air and climate mitigation. But actually carbon in soils is really important for so many other reasons as well, isn't it?
Yeah, so when we talk about carbon and we get all excited about net zero and, it's not going to, soil carbon is not going to do net zero for farming. I'm just going to say that right now. It isn't going to do it. It might do 5 to 10%. But why? But that shouldn't bother us. Getting carbon into your soil is good because it's basically organic matter. So organic matter and carbon, it's the same thing. 50% of all organic matter is carbon. So you kind of, as soon as you talk about carbon, you're talking about organic matter. And what organic matter is basically the fluffiness of soil. That's what gives its pores. That's what gives moisture retention in organic matter. That's where a lot of the nutrients are. So when we talk about carbon in soils, I really want everyone to think, yes, it's contributing a bit to net zero and climate mitigation, but really it's about It means you've got more organic matter in your soils. You're opening it up. That means you've got less compaction. You've got more nutrient cycling, more moisture retention for the droughts. That's why we should want carbon in our soil, is for soil health in the round, with, yes, a bit of it's going to help with respect to net zero.
I love that. Organic matter is the fluffiness in the soil. That's a
very scientific
No,
term.
I love that phrase. I'm gonna nick that if that's all right. I'm gonna keep using that one. That's great. But that key point that it holds more water in the soil, holds more nutrients, delivers that of greater soil structure as well. I think that's often missed in the debate. All really important.
And the carbon is what the bugs are using to grow. Why we've got all the biodiversity in the soil. They're not eating minerals. That isn't giving. We eat food because it's got carbon in it and nutrients. All the bugs and the worms in the soil are eating basically the carbon and the organic matter. So it isn't soil if it's dead and there's no organic matter in it. It's called sand or cement or something like that.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, the challenge or the opportunity, depending on how you want to look at this, of focusing on soil organic matter, and you absolutely must focus on soil organic matter, is that it's the practices which deliver that. It's not just about putting it into the soil, feeding the soil. It's about making sure that there's the right rooting depths, there's a diversity of plants, and the inputs aren't going in which sort of switches off that biology. So with organic farming, which does those things, there's a legal standard around it. There is evidence to show how much more wildlife there is on organic farms, because that soil biodiversity is the start of the food chain, which is supporting the rest of it above ground. And there is more evidence around how those soils can store more water. And that's not just because of the focus on the soils, it's because of the other practices as well that aren't killing off the wildlife or removing their habitats.
Yeah, it's all of these things are linked.
It's a whole system.
So look, I just want to move us on to a little bit about policy, because we've been hearing here about all this decline of soil health in Wales, and of course that's true around the world as well in so many ways, certainly across the UK. But obviously farmers will know it's not in their interest at all to damage soil, but so often farming policy has driven this focus on the short-term production and has led to some of these declines in soil health. So really the killer question at the moment is, to what extent you as a panel believe that the proposed sustainable farming scheme in Wales, will it help promote healthier soils or not? Of course, implementation has been delayed now to 2026. But do we think the sustainable farming scheme, as it's currently contrived, do you think it will help promote healthier soils? I wondered, Non, can I come to you or Sam first, maybe?
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, you've made the point there about the fact that we must remember that the sustainable farming scheme is currently still in proposal. But if we look back at the most recent consultation document, one of the universal actions in there does directly target soils. So I think if we are thinking about what has been published so far, I think that would definitely encourage farmers and land managers to manage their soils effectively. Just going back to our own perspective in Farming Connect, we've got some projects out there which are monitoring similar things to what has been included in the consultation document, and it's great to get farmers to do more than sort of the usual soil analysis and the baselines that they do. But I think it's also important to note that it does take time. So we've got one farm that we work with that has the 170 holes looking directly at doing earthworm counts and grouping those, and it took a whole week to do that across the whole farm. So it is a process, it's a new process, and it's something that will take time. But just go back to the original question, I think the proposals that have been set out would help to encourage better soil health. And I'd just like to pick up, if that's okay, on the points made by Bridget earlier about carbon. We do a lot of work looking at carbon in soils, and just to re-emphasise really, we've got our Welsh Soil Project where we've been working with researchers and universities across the UK to gather evidence and to go out to measure sort of our organic matter in the soils, as well as estimating carbon stocks. So as Bridget mentioned, of course, carbon, very important. We hear a lot about it in net zero terms, but more so also thinking about how these elements interact with one another in the soil. So having that nutrient cycling in the soil and providing farmers with that data, which are baseline data, that will be useful, hopefully, in the future for them. So it's about building that evidence base, concrete evidence that is sort of scientifically based as well, not sort of throwing out a lot of different figures.
Great, thank you. So we're in the Wildlife Trust Wales tent here at the Royal Welsh Agricultural Show, and we're talking about soil, and particularly asking the question here whether the proposed sustainable farming scheme in Wales will help promote healthier soils. I'm going to come to the audience in a moment just to see if there's any questions from the audience. But Sam, first of all, what's your response on behalf of Nature Friendly Farming Network in Wales on this key issue?
On behalf of the network or myself as a farmer?
Well, either. Whatever you feel comfortable doing.
Myself as a farmer, I only hope that it helps, that the policy helps drive us towards healthier, better functioning soils. I think the proof will be in the pudding. And with my NFFN hat on, I think it's looking positive. We responded to the consultation, but again, it's one of those things that we won't know till we get there, until it's playing out in our fields. I think there needs to be a lot more support for regular soil testing. I know on my farm I'd love to see more government-funded help in testing the soils each year, so because I know what I've done right that year or what I've done wrong, and perhaps other things that have impacted it. So doing the farming for healthier soils that I've been doing over the last 4 years, I know when I've had good years, I know I've had bad years, and I'm not sure if it's mostly to do with the weather or my practices. So I'd love to see some support that way through the SFS as well.
Thank you. Andrew Tuddenham from Soil Association, what's your sense at the moment as to whether the scheme is going to actually help improve soil health in Wales?
I think within that question, you've got to think about what is the scheme asking? Is that the right thing? And then what's going to work? Is that going to be taken up? And it's the combination of the two which will see some change in the direction for soils. I think broadly the scheme is trying to focus on a nature-friendly or regenerative approach to farming with nature. It recognises soil health as being key to that. Its proposals are currently around farmers being required to test their soils. Whether that data will be shared in a sort of meaningful way is still being debated, because you've got concerns about data ownership and the value of that data, and where it goes, what's it used for. But the real issue, I think, with soils is to actually have a look at them, and that's where you can start to understand compaction and other things, rooting, number of earthworms. So that's quite an ask. And how you deliver that through a scheme, a photo, as well, I don't know, maybe Niels, again, has got some solutions to how a government would be able to evidence that farms are looking at their soils in that way. It's quite a challenge. It's worth noting, I'm not very familiar with the farming rules for water. Maybe you could say more about this, Craig, but about 3/4 of farms under that requirement, all farms are required to test their soils every 5 years, I believe, and that's looking at the nutrients. And I think only about 3/4 of them are managing to do that. There's about a third aren't. So that's just a sort of, I say it's a time commitment of going out and sampling and then getting a lab to do it. It's not the time commitment of actually digging pits and getting to grips with what your soils are showing. So, there's a challenge there.
There is, most certainly. Let's see if there's anyone in the audience here wanting to ask a question. Gentleman here. Just say who you are as well for the.
I'm Nigel Pugh from Codcadw, the Woodland Trust in Wales. What's the role of trees in soil condition and soil health?
Who wants to take that? Bridget.
So, trees are nearly always deeper rooting. So they can get carbon to depth in a way that many of our monoculture grasslands can't. Trees also, because we don't generally fertilise our woodlands, and we don't generally, it depends what kind of woodlands we're talking about, might use less herbicides and pesticides as well. So woodlands can help improve opening the structure and improve soil health. But I just want to make the point that we do need to check against offshoring our food production. I don't want the second wave of colonialism happening by just sort of saying we'll create a green and pleasant land in Wales and all our food production will go off. Now, what the food production should be, what should be the number of livestock in Wales, that's a whole thing. And I would just say, for the woodland, I think this is the right statistic, and I'm sure you can help me here. We are the second biggest importer of wood after China. So we're not producing enough wood either. And who's not done an Amazon recently? Okay, all that cardboard, that has to come from somewhere. So we do need food, but we do also need fibre and wood. And currently we're not even beginning to produce enough of the food. So trees can help improve and open up the structure of our soils, can help our woodlands produce wood. But that balance between food and wood, the sheep versus trees, how many of you have all been in that argument in many, many panels before now? It's a big discussion we have to have. But we do need wood as well. We do forget that very often. And that has to be at a scale that makes it economically viable, just as food does as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, as a farmer who has sheep grazing around rows of trees, so I planted some trees to help me address the soil compaction in the worst of my field, and it's actually made it, how do I say it, a really awkward field to farm. It takes so much time that the other fields don't take to make sure that those trees don't get nibbled off or browsed off by the sheep. And also it makes it a little bit more difficult to do any tractor work, such as any muck spreading or if I wanted to take a cut of hay. So I feel like the trees are doing the job for me of opening up the soil, and there is no denying that they are addressing that plough pan that we had that was really bad in that field. But there's, I've forgotten the word I'm looking for, there's a trade-off, yes, thank you. There's a trade-off on that, and that field takes more time than it's actually worth, with the setting out the electric fencing, with getting back those lambs that learn to go through electric fencing or that do sometimes get to trees. So I just think that I think there's still a lot of knowledge transfer needs to be done out there, because I went into it thinking I was delivering a solution that could be a win-win. I've put in fruit trees as well, thinking I would have a crop to sell, and I thought, oh, it's all right, I've got years to work out where that market is. And 3 years in, I still don't know where that market is for a limited amount of fruit. With the 60 acres of woodland that we have, I really struggle to find people who will come and fell the trees and then take the timber away, and for me to make any money on that. And I'm trying to be a responsible woodland owner, to do everything sensitively to soil and biodiversity. But so far, I've only ever broken even at best, and at worst, I've been at a loss. So it doesn't. We need to change, I think, our routes to market. There needs to be some help, some infrastructure support put in there for those of us that want to do the right thing around trees on farms.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, gentleman at the back.
Chris Deller, soilish, digging holes, man.
Okay.
Given that in the habitat scheme proposals, if your land is designated habitat, you are not allowed to lime it, whether that's acid grassland or anything. The Welsh Government have currently gone, don't lime it. Bridget, you sit on committees. Why is that?
Because just like acidification isn't great, liming is actually quite an odd thing to do. So just bear with me. Naturally, the lime, if you like, the base canyons come from depth. They're in the minerals. So when you put liming on top, you're putting basically another product on the surface. And just likewise, that for habitat land, all the native species like a certain amount of acidification. They are naturally loving, most of our native plants. They naturally like kind of acid conditions and nutrient-poor conditions. Now, acid rain caused too much acidification, so we want that back, and we don't want ammonia eutrophication. If you go and lime that habitat land, you will wipe out just as effectively some of our native plants, because you will encourage plants that should be on calcareous grassland, right? And most of our native we've got a tiny bit of calcareous grassland in Wales, literally a tiny bit. Most of our habitat land is acid-loving, not too acid and low nutrients. So if you go and lime it, you will absolutely work against the native wildlife that we are trying to encourage back onto that habitat land. And that's why you aren't allowed to lime it. Does that make sense? Yeah. You want to come back?
And
Go
just
on.
a microphone to you, yeah.
Yeah, at the minute we've got habitat land being designated that is Yorkshire fog and creeping bent and creeping thistle, which is being designated as habitat, and often with relatively high nutrient status.
Okay.
So why are we then advising farmers not to lime these?
Yeah,
pieces of land?
on those specifics of why a particular land has been designated, without coming and seeing it, I'm sorry. But that's generally why we don't, is that habitat land, we want to just leave it as it is and try to recover that is. Now, if it's in a degenerate position, and you are right, some of our habitat land is nutrient-rich, mesotrophic, but even then, if it's mesotrophic, you wouldn't go and then put lime on it. You're just putting another pollutant on. Liming is a way of mitigating the acidification effects of fertilizer. We did go and throw lime around in the 80s, and we've now got lime sitting the bottom of our lakes, which is really not good. I mean, it was kind of an emergency measure during acid rain, and we do need it to accompany our fertilization. But I really wouldn't encourage it to go on any of our habitat land. Sorry to not.
We're really running out of time now. Let's take one more question, please. Go on.
Okay, so I'm a farmer. I'm a member of Nature Farming Network. Well, farming has followed basically government policy. So whatever scheme is going to be put forward, if they want us to pay us for trees, then farmers will plant trees. If they want us to protect soils, we protect soils. If they want to, stop runoff and things like that. Ultimately, I need to make a living and feed my family. And so in the past, we've had to increase stock numbers because the price of food, I know there's a food crisis and things, but actually the price of food needs to go higher because otherwise farmers will have to cut corners like it has been doing to produce cheap food, and cheap food has a price, be it the, sorry, I'm not very good at speaking in front of people. So to a detriment of everything else, soils and habitat and everything else. So if people want habitat and good soils and everything else, the price of food has to go up, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Or we import it, cheap food from somewhere else in the world.
Yeah, right. Well, we're going to have to finish in a moment, so I'm just going to come to the panel to each of you in turn to give a response to that and B, just general kind of final thoughts about this huge issue that we've been talking about this morning. Let me come to you first, Niels. I'll go along the line.
I think that I feel kind of optimistic about the future. I don't have a lot of experience with SFS, but I feel that there is a movement now developing within the farming community, and it is a sort of grassroots, no pun intended, movement. And I think that the more that we can sort of speak to our neighbours, engage with farming groups, engage with the network, lobby the trust, for example, and start trying to build that sort of strength and build on that, I think, and we can go places.
Great, thank you. Sam from the Nature Friendly Farming Network Wales.
I'm glad that there's been a delay with the SFS in that. I hope that it sort of addresses the more how nuanced it is a subject, not just for soil, but the whole policy around farming. And to touch on what the gentleman said over here is I know several people who can't afford food at the moment, the sort of quality of food that they deserve. But I think we all know in the room that supermarkets perhaps make the most on what we sell as farmers and then on what we buy back from them. Selling milk at 35p and buying a litre at £1 something. It's obvious where the profits are going, and I think that might be somewhere where we could help to bring food down if they weren't quite so intent on making so much profit, so more people could afford the food, the quality of food that we deliver, along with all the other benefits for the environment.
Thank you, Sam. So, Dr. Non Williams from Farming Connect.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on some of the points made there, really, about what we're discussing today, soils, the role in terms of biodiversity and productivity, but the very good points made there about agriculture as an industry and sort of the other contributions, the community and lots of the Future Generations and Wellbeing Act priorities that are being delivered through the agricultural industry here in Wales. So I think that's an important point to make, but just to bring it back to the subject we're discussing in this panel today, I think there's lots of opportunities here. We've all touched upon very similar themes across the panel today, and farmers and land managers do acknowledge the importance of soil. And as we've heard, there's a lot of data collection going on, evidence-based data collection. So I think that's a really important point to make. We've got farmers on board. We're doing a lot of knowledge exchange events, and we're seeing good uptake, and farmers really do want to learn about the subject and how we can move forward. So we've heard a lot about the challenges, but I also feel there's opportunity if we all work together, but at the same time consider that each farm is different, so each farm's approach might be a little bit different.
Great, thank you very much. Andrew Tuddenham from the Soil Association.
Yeah, 100%. I'd echo that completely. I think there is a lot to be hopeful about. If you look on Google Trends, which shows you what people are searching for and how popular those searches are, soil health is on the rise. That term, soil health, has sort of quadrupled in search terms over the last 5 years. It is the conversation, and you see that within regenerative as well, within the whole sort of movement that's building around that, which is providing farmers with that way in to managing their soils and managing their whole systems ultimately. I think I've been a bit down on the SFS, or sort of doubtful about it, but it's going to be more than the SFS that delivers some change or supports some change. I think what the gentleman said there is absolutely on the money. It does need to be coupled with a few other things like fairness in the supply chain, principally. But also let's not forget just what the price of fertiliser has done for this whole conversation over the last few years. Completely changed it. Now farmers are being driven by lots of different drivers, and the SFS is just one of those things. It's really important, but it's just one of those things. So, across the piece, I'm optimistic.
Okay, great. And then final word to you, Bridget.
So I'm perhaps a little... it's great. I come to a lot of these panels and see some amazing farmers doing amazing things, but I worry whether they're the top 10, 20, 30% of people that are able to just take those risks and what have you. And I just wonder whether we need to find a way to help people do that systemic change. We've now got such an issue with net zero, soil health, biodiversity. We must find a way to help people make a systems level change, not field, do a little bit on that woodland there and a little bit on that field there, to actually change a whole system, which it sounds like we've got a great example on the panel here. And also in terms of soil testing, yes, it is the main capital that any farmer has, is their land. And when we say land, soil, that's the main thing. It's not all your soil is the thing you will hand to the next generations. And I just worry that in terms of measuring and looking at your soil, uplands, it should be compaction and acidity. In the improved lands, it's compaction and nutrients. Arable land, it's and carbon. And I just think we need to bespoke even the looking at your soil to what the issues are. It's not the same issue across every bit of land. There is not a nutrient problem of phosphorus in the uplands, right? So let's not waste farmers' money or government money measuring it up there, because it's not the problem. Compaction is and acidity is. On our improved grass, definitely NP, compaction and carbon. On an arable, definitely NP. So we just need to be wise, otherwise we will lose all credibility if we ask people to pay and go and spend their precious time measuring things that aren't actually an issue for those bits of land. So it's just, I want people to look at their soil, feel it, touch it, measure it, but let's make sure that's as efficient as possible, because everyone is right up against it. I do understand, and just making a living at the moment. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Bridget, for finishing us off there. I hope you find this has been a really useful conversation about soil and exploring everything about soil, although we very quickly run out of time because it's something that we could spend several days talking about. But just to say, as the Wildlife Trust Wales, we're here for the next 2-3 days with events in this tent taking place. So please drop by and join other discussions. The next big one that we've got today is at 1 o'clock here in the Wildlife Trust Wales tent, where I'll be chairing a discussion about farming with nature with Carolyn Thomas, MS, Rachel Sharp from Wildlife Trust Wales, Tony Davis from the Nature Friendly Farming Network, Megan Gibbon from People's Trust for Endangered Species, and Flora Price, a farmer. So do join us between 1 and 2 for that discussion. I'm really sorry that we didn't get to everyone that had their hand up for a question this afternoon. Sorry that we ran out of time for that, but thanks so much for your interest. And please give a thank you to our brilliant panel, Niels Corfield, Sam Kenyon, Non Williams, Andrew Tuddenham and Bridget Emmett. Thank you very much.